All right, you're good to go.
Okay. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you so much for joining me for seasonal painting with Derwent Inktense. This afternoon, we're going to be painting a really beautiful holly Christmas card together, a seasonal Christmas card, which is going to lift our spirits. And it's really simple to create. On your materials list, you can either use a blank greetings card. So I always have at my stock all through the year, simple watercolour greeting card. Or you can use good quality watercolour paper and then simply fold it in half. Either is acceptable, it's fine, because you're not going to be using a lot of water anyway. Your printable, which you will find with your class details, and you will have had an outline. Simply just draw it onto your card. Which is this one, because it doesn't leave a lot of graphite on your paper. Don't worry if you make a mistake. There's no such thing as doing something wrong. It's easy to remove. There's no right or wrong. You're not going for photorealism. It's about playing with colour. So you can have as many berries as you like. You can have as many holly leaves as you like. It's not about doing it exactly to your photo or your reference. If you've got the Derwent Inktense palette, brilliant. If you haven't, you can use Inktense blocks, you can use pencils, you can use watercolour if you haven't got the Derwent Inktense, it's fine. If I go too fast for you, please do say. Molly is in the comments in the chat section. Drop her a message and say, Judith, please slow down, because sometimes I get ahead of myself, so you must tell me. Or if I've said something and you haven't quite caught it, again, do say to me, Judith, please do repeat that, because I do talk a lot. You will find this. I can talk for hours, so please do tell me if I just prattle on for ages and I've lost you at some point. With this image here, the first thing we're going to do is we're actually going to put the dark background in. That might sound really odd, but we're not going to use white at all. Instead of painting with white, with Inktense, we leave the white. We're going to use it as negative, so we're not going to paint the white. Unlike watercolour, we're not using masking fluid, which you may have heard if you've been a watercolour painter. We're just literally going to leave it alone. In your palette, or any watercolour palette, I use these water brushes. They come with your Inktense palette. If you've got one at home, they have the water in the handle. I can be a bit of a messy painter, so for me at home this is ideal because I don't have to have water in pots. And I've ruined laptop PC before now and made a bit of a mess. Squeeze a bit of water into your palette. In your palette, you've got some nice greens, or use some green Inktense from your block and really give it a good smush. Really work it in. And make a lovely thick, bright mixture of green. You want it to be quite rich, not insipid. What's nice about Inktense is permanent once dry. So much easier to use than watercolour. It means you can layer it and layer it and layer it. You don't have to worry about the tricky things with watercolour, such as hard lines or cauliflowers, we call them, where your watercolour splits. So you need a nice thick mix. There's a sponge in these palettes This is for cleaning your brush. Don't ever do what I did. When I first got my palette, I wondered what it was and I threw it away. I thought it was packing material. Don't do that. Don't throw it away. Just clean your brush on it by dragging your brush up and down. In your next well, let's make a nice dark blue. So squeeze your brush, give it a good mush. You really want it to have some nice bright colours. So I've got a blue and a green. Okay. I also have some kitchen paper next to me. And what I do with that kitchen paper is I just clean my brush on it. I always find it's better to start with a clean brush, just a little bit. If you are right-handed, I'd like you to start on the top left. If you are left-handed, start on the top right. Then you're not going to be getting it on your hand underneath. What I'd like you to do is just pick up one of the colours. So I'm going to pick up a bit of green. And in the negative space, you don't squeeze the brush. All water brushes have a valve inside. It does it for you. And then pick up a bit of blue. So you're painting blue and green at the same time. And just paint in the negative space. Keep an eye on your reference picture if you're not sure where those negative spaces are. And just work your way around. So then I'm starting in this top center. Think of it as a clock face. If this is the middle of your clock, this would be at 12 o'clock at the top. What's nice with Inktense is you don't get any of the hard lines and the hard joins. If you were to paint with watercolor like this, you'd be getting cauliflowers, hard lines, joins. You can't do it with watercolor. Inktense is very forgiving. It's a lot easier to use. Once it's dry, you can go over it and over it and over it again, however many times you want. And it won't disturb the layer underneath. Just work your way around. And go around the edges of the outside. Don't forget to drop in some blue with your green as well. Don't worry if it's looking a little bit insipid. That's absolutely fine, because we can put in another layer.
Judith, it's Molly. Stacy, several people are commenting that they can't see the screen that Judith is working on. They can only see her. Is it because they're not in speaker view?
Yes, that could be that they're not in speaker view. I have the main camera spotlighted right now.
Okay.
So if anyone is having trouble, the class is being recorded and you will be able to see everything. It'll be posted tomorrow on our YouTube channel and on our website. So if you're having trouble, you will be able to see this later.
Okay, so work around where it'd be 3 o'clock. So if you're right-handed, you'll be working at 3 o'clock now. And don't forget to keep dropping in your blues and your greens at the same time. Keep giving your paint a mix. Don't let it settle, especially if you're using Inktense blocks. Sometimes the pigment can settle, so you just need to give it a bit of a mix. What's nice with Inktense is they work really quickly. You can make really effective Christmas cards or paintings in a short amount of time. You don't have to pre-wet your area. So if you were doing this in watercolor, this is quite a large area. And I would be very hesitant about painting this without wetting the paper first. Because this is Inktense, and it's got no gum arabic in it. Inktense has no gum arabic. So Inktense isn't going to have the same problems that you have with watercolor, such as your hard lines, such as your joins. It's not going to split. I don't have to worry about wetting the paper first, which when I said to you when we first started, you don't have to worry about stretching it because we're not going to be using as much water as we normally would when we're painting a background. And it's because there's no gum arabic in any of these products. They're a lot easier to use. Very forgiving. It's a bit more like painting with acrylics than it is watercolor, with the same effect as watercolor. If it looks a bit insipid, don't worry, because we can still go in later and add another layer. The other neat thing about Inktense, all water-based media dries back at least 2 shades lighter. Inktense doesn't do that. Inktense has very little color shift. It only dries back 1 shade lighter, which makes it a lot simpler to predict what color you're going to come out with at the end. Okay, so whilst I've done all the outsides, I'm just going to look to see if there's any bits in the middle where I need to pop in the negative painting. And then just let that dry. I'm just going to let you catch up a minute. Don't worry if you get air bubbles. Don't worry about trying to pop them. They will settle on their own. The palettes are really easy to clean. You just wipe them out with a damp cloth, or sometimes I just use the kitchen cleaner or the baby wipes that you can get. Okay, we're going to create this snow. Just this bit here. It's really, really subtle. What I'd like you to do, from your water brush or with a little bit of water, squeeze a tiny bit into your palette. And then take some of your blue that's left over and just drop it in. So you're making a really, really weak wash, a really weak wash. And you're going to do barely there painting. You're just going to drop it in and you're going to dab it on like little dots. A bit like the pointillism artists used to do. So you're going to dot your paintbrush just along this join here. Let me just focus my camera.
Hey Judith, a few people are asking just the difference between the Inktense and watercolor. Would you mind just quickly explaining that?
No problem. So watercolor isn't permanent when it dries. Inktense is permanent when it dries. Inktense is pigment and not dye. Watercolor has more dye based. So it means that Inktense, you can use it on fabric, you can use it on any porous material, and when it dries, it's permanent. So you can wash it and it will still be there. You can wash it on a 30 degree wash. So you can use it on silks, cottons, anything like that, as well as paper. You can layer it and layer it and layer it, and the layer underneath is not going to shift. Watercolor, you can't do that. Watercolor, you're going to lift it off. So you can do lift out techniques with watercolor. You can remove the watercolor once it's dry, so you can create clouds and things. You can't do that with Inktense because it's permanent once it's dry. So there's two very different qualities of it. So Inktense behaves more like an acrylic, although it's a watercolor media, whereas watercolor doesn't do that. Inktense has no gum arabic in it, so you don't have the inherent qualities such as cauliflowers, such as when you get a split. So very similar to when you go to a fuel station and you see the fuel on the floor, and where it hits water, it then splits out and you see the separation of colors. When you have a watercolor wash, that's sometimes what can happen, and it can be very demoralizing when you get that, and it's very hard to control. Because Inktense has no gum arabic in it, that doesn't happen. So it's easier to make large washes without that splitting of color, without that splitting of pigment. Inktense pan sets are 100% light fast, so they're guaranteed not to fade. Watercolor has inherent problems of fading. It's just its nature of a media. Unfortunately, that does fade, especially on reds. The Inktense palette is guaranteed not to fade. The other thing which I like about Inktense, although it's only got 12 colours in the palette, I've made 144 colours out of it. Watercolour, I can mix 2 or 3 times and then it becomes muddy. Inktense doesn't become muddy because it hasn't got the gum arabic into it. So out of the 12 small pans, I made 144 colours and I could have kept going. It doesn't become, the shades stay nice and vibrant and clean. After 144, I gave up. I couldn't face doing any more. I was defeated. I proved my point. They're the key differences. But I suppose for me, the one thing is you can use it on fabric. So it opened up a whole world of different crafts and different arts that I could do. What you must do to make it permanent is wet out all the pigment and let it dry. If you don't wet all the pigment and let it dry, it doesn't become permanent. There's nothing in Inktense that requires you to heat set it, so you don't need to iron it. There's nothing in there that requires heat activation. So you can use it on really awkward pieces of fabric. So you can use it on your trainers, your sneakers, things like that you couldn't normally iron or press, because there's nothing in it that requires ironing or heat setting. So Inktense is quite neat in that respect. Does that help? I've rabbled on for ages. I told you I could.
Yeah, that was great. Thanks, Judith.
I did warn you, Molly.
No, it's all good.
Okay, so we've got a bit of snow here. So this is dried nice and pale. With your same wash, the really pale one, pop some dots behind where these berries are. You can also use Inktense on wood, which is nice. So if you want to do place settings or things like that, or the birch panels, Inktense is really nice on those. You can't use watercolour on things like that. And there's a bit of snow up here as well. We're still ignoring these white outer areas. We're pretending they're not even there. And then I'd like you to mix up a pale green. So in my palette, I've got this kiwi green and lime green. Again, make it quite thick. And I think I've got another dark green. So I'm going to make a dark green, but I'm going to make a mid green by putting two greens together. You can create any green you like. You just want it to be different than the first one you used. There's no right or wrong. You just want to create three greens.
Judith, as you start painting, someone asked if you could explain the difference between the Inktense blocks and the Inktense paint pans. So if you don't mind just covering that off as you're painting, I'd appreciate it. Thank you.
I'm just filling my water brush. The way I describe it is Inktense blocks are very much like using pastels. They very much feel like a pastel artist does. The blocks, the pan set glide more when you're painting with them. So the blocks have a bit more of a grainier texture because they were designed for the pastel artist. Whereas the pan sets, when you paint with them, they glide more. They are softer to use. They almost feel a bit as though they have glycerin or honey in them. You can use the blocks for painting with them, but they don't release the pigment as readily as the pan set does. But what they do is you can make interesting marks with them. You can use them on their side and on their end. So they are fantastic for the pastel artist or for the mark maker or the expressive artist. What I do say is if you are like detail, stick with the pencils. If you like mark making, or if you like mixed media, go for the blocks. If you're a painter, go for the pan set. What's in the pan set is not the same as the blocks. They are a different composition. They're not that different. The colors are the same, but they're just different to use ever so slightly. So if you were starting off fresh and you were a painter, go for the pan sets. If you were a mixed media artist, go for the blocks. And if you were somebody who likes precision, go for the pencils. But they do feel slightly different. Okay, so we've got a bit of an upturned leaf here, but it's quite dark inside. But the first thing I would like you to do is, I'd actually like you to paint in the veins on all of these. Let's just put I'm using my palest green. And then by the time we get around to putting the details in, they'll be nice and dry. Hopefully it's a bit warmer where you are. The studio is very cold tonight, so it takes a bit longer to dry. Okay, so don't go where your hand's going to be resting. So just stick with the top for now. Okay, so I'm just going to stick with those leaves at the top of the picture. Then I'm going to pick up my greens. I'm going to paint the inside of this leaf. And paint around where you put the vein. Now it will run in, but that's the effect you want. You want it to be nice and soft. What you don't want to do is paint over it. You're going to paint around them. Don't worry if they disappear. Because when they dry, you'll see that it shines through. And it is varied. Then on your next one, pick up some different colours. And again, paint it in between. You can even pick up some blues. And just work your way around. Don't forget to stay away from your snow. You can soften up the edge. Don't lose the snow. And keep picking up the different greens. You don't want it all in the same green. Don't worry if you lose your vein, we can get this back after. You're mapping the colours out. And then work your way around to the next leaf, but make sure you pick up different greens. So Inktense lays down really quite quickly. You can even pick up some blues. Don't forget the lime green. Now what I'd like you to do is smush your brush straight into your palette and just darken the areas in the sections whilst they're still wet. Around the veins. And this is how you're going to start making your holly leaves stand out. So put some shadows in. So you're picking the greens straight up off the palette. Or your blocks, you can pick them straight up off your blocks as well. But you're painting either side of the veins. So your veins have got an underpainting. And you can pick up blue as well. Now everything goes through what I call an ugly stage. So don't think, you know, mine looks terrible at the moment. Everything goes through what I call an ugly stage. It will come out the other side, I promise you. Don't forget to pick up some blues.
Judith, people are asking if the Inktense dries lighter or darker. And then they're
Dries.
also wanting
Yep.
to know if they can re-wet the paint once it's in the palette, like in the mixing area.
Okay, so it dries one shade lighter rather than darker. And I find, no, it doesn't re-wet very well. It's not like watercolor where you re-wet it. It has slightly, but I always find I mix it up new. I don't find it ever so effective if I try and re-wet it. I tend to wash my palette out and start again. Is better. Was that all of it, Molly? I feel as though I might have missed something there.
Nope, that was it. Thank you.
Okay, so once you've got your underpainting in, don't forget to pick up straight from the palette and just darken this leaf so it stands out from the background. Again, don't worry if you get bubbles. These will settle on their own. We've got a little leaf behind here. I'm going to paint that in neat without putting in a wash first. And I'm doing that so I've got more control, because I need it to stand out from the background. And I want to also go over this one a little bit more. It's just a little bit soft around the edges. So this is what I mean. You can go over it and over and over it, very much like acrylic, which is something I could not do if you were using watercolor. It's far more forgiving. And you can tighten up edges. But don't overwork it, let it dry. And as that's drying, I'd like to cover the berry with you. Now I've run out of holes on my palette. So what I want you to do is, if you've run out of holes, take a bit of kitchen roll and just clean one. They're really easy to clean, these palettes. And just mix yourself quite a thick mix of red. Now a berry is a three-dimensional shape. So it's going to have a highlight and it's going to have a darker area. Unlike the leaves and unlike the background, what I want you to do is I want you to put a layer of water or paint over a berry first. So just give it a layer of water. You'll have to trust that you've done it because you won't be able to see it. So you have to trust that you've done it. Pick up a little bit of red, just a tiny bit on the end of your paintbrush. Drop it in and spread it over your berry and then dry your brush off. Pick up some more of the red and make it darker around the outside. Dry your brush off. Then I'd like you to soften the join, but not get rid of the highlight. So you're controlling how wet the water brush is by drying it off on the kitchen towel. Then pick up some more of the red paint and go around the very outside. Dry your brush off and just soften the join again. And then the very last point, put your brush straight into the palette. Pick up just neat red paint and paint it in very dark around the outside. So let's repeat that again with a berry. Clean your brush off. Let's pick another berry and paint in a layer of water on the berry. And dry your brush off. Pick up a small amount of red paint and put a layer over the berry. And dry your brush off. Pick the red up again.
People are asking how the water brush works, if you have to squeeze it, and I think that's probably better.
Yeah, you don't have to squeeze them. Water brushes have a non-return valve in, so they're pressure sensitive. So what happens is as you press down on the bristles of the brush, the water comes out on its own. So you never have to press the handle. The only time you have to press the handle is if you want to override the pressure, the valve system inside to create more water to come out. So you never actually have to squeeze this bit. The valve is in here. And how it works is as you press down on the bristles, it lets the water out on its own. So as I'm painting, I pick it up and I don't squeeze the handle. However, how high I put on the bristles is how much water comes out. Hence why I then dry it off. If I want to create a wash and let out more water, I then squeeze the handle to let more water out. That's the Derwent ones. There are other ones on the market where they're not as good quality as the Derwent ones, and you do have to squeeze the handles. I find them too tricky to use because I can't paint and squeeze at the same time. I get in a terrible mess. Okay, so let's do one where it's going behind. Put a layer of water down. It would be darker behind the one in front. Pick up a layer of red and do your light wash and dry your brush. Then pick up your red again and start from where it's darker and then soften the edge and dry your brush. So always start at the darkest bit. Dry your brush off and then let's soften the join. So your highlight is the bit that's not tucked behind the berry in the front. And then we're going to leave this one here because if we try to do it next to two that are wet, they'll bleed together and we won't get that nice hard edge. So let's do one away from it. Wet your berry. So choose a berry that's not next to another two. Add in a bit of red. So I need to make some more red up. Go for the bit that's tucked behind. Then make it darker in the shadow. If you get a hard edge here, just dry your brush off and just soften that edge. And just work your way around the berries. They won't take you long, you can whiz around them. One thing you'll notice in your drawing is all your berries are done in odd numbers. Reason why I've done that is with any drawing and composition is everything looks better in odd numbers. So if you're doing yours, try and keep it to 1 or 3 or 5, because as humans, we like things better when they're odd. So I've done you 1 here, then we've had 3, and we have 3 up here. So just as humans, we like things better in odd numbers. So if you're putting your own berries in, just bear that in mind. And you can do some berries up here as well whilst they're drying.
Judith, someone asked if the technique that you're using, if that will work for watercolor as well.
Yes, it will. It looks very nice in watercolor. And with watercolor, what you can do is you can lift off the highlights. So with Inktense, you can't lift the highlights out, but with watercolor, you can lift the highlights out. So that's one of the differences between Inktense and watercolor. Because Inktense is permanent, you can't lift the highlights back out. So you need to pre-plan where your highlights are. With watercolor, you can lift the highlights back out. So you don't have to pre-plan quite so much with something like the berries. Drying. And they should be dry enough now to paint next to them. Inktense is a bit like painting jigsaws. You can go along and do a bit here, a bit there, and work backwards and forwards. You can do it while you're watching television at night. They're convenient to put away and get back out, and to take away with you as well. They're very convenient to take away. The only thing you have to bear in mind is if you fly with water brushes, never fly with fluid in the handle, because the air pressure does make it leak and does make it explode. I know from experience. Makes a terrible mess. So just work your way around. The other thing is, if your berries start to make a strange shape, don't try and correct the circles, because what happens when you're trying correcting a circle is that circle is going to get bigger and bigger and bigger. because our brain tries to perfect it. And our left side of our brain doesn't always talk to our right quite the same. So you'll end up with a massive, massive berry and it still won't be circular. So the best thing to do is embrace the wonky berry rather than trying to make it circular, because it will end up the same size as a dinner plate by the time you're finished. So just embrace the wong. And don't forget the berries down at the bottom. Okay, so if like me, you just forgot to put a layer of water down there, it's not the end of the world, but you'll see it's not as three-dimensional as the other ones were. You will notice a difference. Lift it out. It just doesn't come out the same as watercolor would without flooding it. Okay, so don't panic. You can wet it and wet it, and it will, some of it will come out, but just leave that one if you do what I did. There we go. Can save it, but it just doesn't get as three-dimensional as if you wet it first. And then just look for ones where you haven't finished them. And any gaps where there's some berries hiding behind. It's really easy to miss them. So do scan your eye over it, just to make sure you haven't missed any. Okay, and then give your brush a clean. In your palette, you might have like a dark purple. Here, I'll get your piece of paper. Okay, so it comes out like a dark purple. What you're looking for is that kind of colour. A plum. What I'd like you to do, you want it quite thick. Just the very tip of your brush. So dry your brush off. You're not going to be pressing on the bristles, so it's not going to be letting out water. And just add bits in the very shadowed bits behind. So where the V's are. Dry your brush off and then just soften them. So just add a bit of shadow. Again, just with the very, very point of your brush. So it's not going to be letting the water out so much. So the pressure valve. I want to pick an area. So, okay, so my studio is really cold at the moment, being in the UK. Hopefully it's much warmer where you are in the US. Okay, so I want to pick an area in the background here in particular, where I've got bubbles, to show you where you can layer where you've had before with your paint, and it will go over it. I'm just going to mix a bit more of the background blue and green. Okay. You can paint over this another layer. You don't have to match the colours exactly at all. Inktense is naturally translucent, which means the colours you laid down before are going to show through. So you can layer over this background, which will keep making it darker and darker. So I don't have to worry about the bubbles that show through here, because you can just paint over them. You can do this however many times you like. You can adjust the colours. So if you think, well, actually my background is looking a little bit too blue or a little bit too green, you can adjust it. It's not a bother. So when these berries are dry here, I'll make this background a lot darker. And this gap here is too green because it's not letting the leaves in the front show out and jump forward or pop. So I'm going to put some more blue in this bit at the back. So don't have to worry about the bubbles that were there beforehand that had dried. So with Inktense, you can layer it and layer it. With watercolor, you can't do this. The previous layer will just lift off. The leaf now is popping forward because I've put more blue in the background. And now you can see how vibrant it becomes. See, this is one layer and that's two layers. There is a real difference with Inktense when you layer it. That's one of the key selling points of it, is the layering abilities. Okay, so we've got time to still put in another leaf. This time, what I want to do is I want to leave these veins white. We're going to do it slightly differently. I'd like you to put in a layer of water onto one of the segments, just like you did with the berries. So we're going to do these ones slightly differently. So let's paint in just the segments with water on one of the sides of the leaf. Slightly different technique. And just drop it in a little bit of the colours. So I've picked up a little bit of green. Then I'm going to drop in a little bit of blue. In that segment. Maybe in the next segment, it's going to be a little bit more vivid. But I'm avoiding the vein. So the veins are going to be staying white. And I might put some blue. And green in the next segment. And because we put the water down first, like the berries, the colours all bleed into each other. And they just make a bit more delicate leaf, which you can use for botanical work. So Inktense can be used for botanical work. It doesn't always have to be bright and vibrant. It can be very delicate work as well. It doesn't always have to be lurid and in your face. And then again, do the leave the segments, the veins alone, and the snow. And then just drop in colours of your choice.
Judith, we're getting a couple questions where people are using the Inktense pencils and either like brushing them off the tip to get the pigment or just trying to use the pencils. Can you just kind of speak to the differences between the pencils and the paint pans, and then maybe how they could best get some of the same effect with the pencils?
Yeah, what you can do is you can sketch the pencils on first. Bear with me 1 second. Okay, so if I was to do this next leaf here, there's lots of different ways you can do it. Okay, so if I'm using an Inktense pencil, you can either sketch a light layer. Now you only need to use it very light because they're packed with pigment. If you use it heavy, you will be really surprised at what comes out. I always use my Inktense pencil sharp, again for that reason. It controls how much pigment you're letting out. And I've got a blue, so I'm joining the two together. Inktense comes into its very best when you add water. Before you add water, they're just really a colour pencil. Then I add water. Keep drying my brush in between, because the water will pool slightly because you're dragging the Inktense pencil round. Okay, and then what I do is I borrow the pencil pigment into the next section. Because they've got so much pigment in them, you can always borrow it. You'd be surprised how much is contained in that little bit of pencil. So it's very blue. So the next bit I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure I've got more green in this section. So I'm putting a very light layer of green in here. Again, add more water. Because I haven't used much pencil, it's easier to not get streaky. The more pencil you use, the streakier it can get. I'm going to borrow some of that pigment for the next section. Now, somebody said about taking it off the brush, off the pencil. I never find it overly effective. I find it far easier to colour onto the paper and then add it, but you can darken it by picking it off the pencil. The other thing you can do is you can then very lightly onto a damp piece of paper just add a little bit more of the Inktense pencil onto the areas you want it darker. Once it dries, it's going to become permanent. If you want to smooth it out, dry your brush off, just pull it. Pick up another bit of your blue and just draw into it whilst it's still damp. As long as that pigment has been wetted out, it will be permanent once dry. The other thing you can do, more so with watercolour pencils than Inktense, but you can do it, you have a window of opportunity to do it, is you can make yourself a palette. So if you scribble onto a piece of paper, you can then pick up the ink like a palette. You can do this if you're using blocks as well, and then paint with it. So you might find that easier to control than trying to pick it up off the pencil. So say, for example, and then I want to pick up some of the green. That's easier to control and smoother than trying to pick it up off the pencil. Once that's dry, it's permanent. So you do have to keep making yourself a bit of a palette. Does that help with using Inktense pencils?
Yeah, Judith, I think that was fantastic. Thank you.
It was a bit of an ad hoc one for you.
No, it's good. I think, the whole Inktense line is great, but, if you just have one type, then you can certainly achieve a similar effect.
They all work together. Okay, so
Yeah.
if you've used Inktense pencils and you want to use a bit of a block or the pan set, you can use them together. They all play nicely together. That's the other thing to bear in mind, is they do complement each other.
Yeah.
There's nothing in the Derwent line that doesn't work well with other things.
Well, and the vibrancy, I think, is just so unique compared to anything else out there.
Yeah, it is. It is completely unique. How long have we got left, Molly?
I think we're at the time. So I think some people are needing to have just kind of allotted an hour. So whatever you're comfortable with, Judith.
Well, what you can do is have a practice. So you'll be able to finish this off, and I hope you do finish them off. And do share them as well on your social media or email them in. I'm sure everybody would love to see what you do. I love seeing what people create. Do make sure you go over the background as well again. So I now know that these berries are dry, so I can put in another layer and adjust it so your leaves pop out. And you can make it more blue, more green, but do share what you create. Send them to your friends and family. I'd love to see what you do. And your friends and family will love to get a handmade card of you. You can't beat a handmade card. There's nothing quite like it. There really isn't. I think they're the best cards that you can receive because it's part of you. And there's nothing quite like putting a bit of you into something like this. It's thoughtful and it's caring. Have a great holidays. Happy holidays to you all. And thank you so much for joining me this afternoon. It's been lovely to spend some time with you all.